Welcome to the Morphosis, where we explore transformation at the intersection of soul and system. I'm Yuri, founder of Metamorphosis. Now, today's conversation starts with a simple question. Why do we scan every part of the body, but rarely the brain? If you break a bone, get an x-ray. If you got chest pain, you get a scan. If something feels off physically, we look at the organ. But when someone says, I feel overwhelmed, I can't focus, I think I've got ADHD, we rarely look at the organ that's driving it all. Instead, we label, we guess, and we build stories. Now today, we're exploring a different approach. Peter O'Mara Kane, co-founder of Evolve Neuro, works at the intersection of neuroscience and lived experience. His work is about making the invisible visible, measuring brain activity in real time, and translating patterns into something people can actually understand. Not to dramatize, not to judge, but to clarify. Now, in this episode, we explore what variability in the brain actually means, how a 5-minute ADHD assessment works, and what changes when data replaces assumptions, and where this fits into the long-term mental fitness. Because sometimes what feels like identity is pattern, and sometimes what feels broken is just simply dysregulated. So take a breath, stay tuned, and let's begin.
Yeah, it's making the invisible visible. I think the really simple example is every part of our body, if you have a problem and you go to a doctor, they'll generally listen or they'll look or they'll scan, you'll get an x-ray, you'll get a CT, you get all these various different things. But if you go to your GP or your psychiatrist or psychologist and you say, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling agitated, we don't look at the organ. The brain is the one organ that doesn't get looked at when people have an issue with it. So what we've really focused on is how do we find the data that explains how people are experiencing the world? And then can we give them actionable insights as to why that's happening? And there's no judgment. It's completely validating. It's just to say, this is how your brain has developed for whatever reason. This is how you see the world. And that's okay. There's nothing good, there's nothing bad. It's just how you see the world. Sometimes you'll be overwhelmed. Sometimes you'll overwhelm other people. And here's some really simple tools that might help you personally. It's trying to personalize the experience for each individual. And that's a big piece of what we're leaning into.
I want to go into that a little bit more in a second,
Sure.
especially the kind of impact that it has on themselves and the environment, of course, because it's the impact that it generates. As you said before, what kind of fascinates me about your work is that you make the invisible visible. That's a great way. People are, including myself, maybe in the past tense, very distracted, overwhelmed. They couldn't really see what the brain was doing at that particular point of time as well. So you'll translate brain states and nervous system patterns into something people can see and recognize in themselves. So let's start on that basis. For someone who's never heard of Evolve Neuro, how would you describe what you do in plain language? What happens in the session and what are you measuring?
Yeah, it's a great question. In our most simplest form, when someone comes to meet us, we measure the electrical signals in their brain. So we literally measure how their brain is performing, and again, without any judgment. So that involves a 5 to 10 minute scan. It's non-invasive. It's sensors similar to the sensor you have on a smartwatch, slightly more complex, slightly more accurate, we would say. And those sensors allow us to pick up the activity in your brain. So the electrical signals in your brain. So everything that happens in our brain is controlled by connectivity between neurons, and we're just measuring them. And what we're ultimately building for each person is a map. So it's a map of that person's brain. And the map is the insight into their personality, their life. As you mentioned, why am I feeling anxious? Why am I feeling overwhelmed? What's going on? Why am I the way I am? This is the most fundamental question. And you can track thousands of years of philosophy. And the big thing, there was a stage where people didn't even know if our consciousness came from our heart or from our heads. And I think we maybe still haven't fully answered that question, but what we can certainly say is our brain is the CEO of everything that goes on for us. And what we can do with this measurement is we can as we've said before, make the invisible visible, but reveal the curtain. Show someone this is your brain, this is how it operates. And it's an amazing thing. We are the only known entity in the universe who can observe the way they think. But nothing else can do that. We really are in this incredible moment where you can hook up some technology, look at a screen, we can show you the waves of your brain as you engage, as you blink, as you grind your teeth. Everything on the screen changes because that's how sensitive the information is. So you are observing your own thoughts or your own brain waves in real time. So it's as simple as that. But it's amazing. I overuse this phrase, but it's consistently people say this is mind blowing.
The model is that people go into a clinic in their local city, or how does that go in terms of the kind of the logistics?
We spend a lot of time thinking about how do we make this experience as impactful, as powerful, and as meaningful as possible, but at the same time, making it accessible. We don't want to make it so expensive so it is only available to a small number of people. So there's this constant balance. And as we all know, the more people that are involved in that chain, the more expensive these things get. We'll build multiple different solutions. One of the solutions we're building is a rapid assessment for things like ADHD. So if someone wants to currently go through the process of an ADHD assessment, it can take months and years. Outcome will be a full diagnosis. What we're saying is we can give you an insight, a pre-diagnosis to how your brain is operating and whether you are likely to have ADHD. There's more depth beyond that, but we can do that from a 5 to 10 minute scan. So much faster, much easier. And then that can be delivered through partner clinics. But what we have decided is in order to keep those costs down for people and also give the most valuable experience, we want to have our own clinics. So we've decided that we'll be opening our own space, and that will likely start in 2 or 3 locations, London being an obvious one. Also looking at places like Dubai and a few different places across the Middle East because we've had a lot of interest there. There's also a whole host of reasons that's interesting. But within these clinics, if you've seen businesses like Nico Health, where they do this 3D scan of your physical body, we're thinking like that for the brain. So you walk in, it's calm, it's calming, it's a really beautiful environment. You sit down in a comfortable chair, we put this gentle scan on, you engage with the screen and the surroundings around you, the soft lighting, soft sound. Then we measure the brain. That maybe will be 5 to 10 minutes. And immediately we can show you in real time how your brain is performing. And then that drops into our technology. And from there, we bring up your full map and we can show you up to hundreds of different brain areas, but we'll focus on the 10 areas that there's the most variance from norm. And all that means is the way that you're different to norm. There's no such thing as normal, but from a data perspective, we have to have a normative.
Yeah.
So we're looking at standard deviations away from that norm. And the more standard deviations that we have, the more insights we can give people and the more specific we can be about how they show up in the world. So it will be very much an enjoyable experience. We'll do the scan and we'll show the data, and then the individual will get 30 minutes speaking to either a doctor or a neuroscientist to ask all those questions. What does this mean? What can I do with this information? What we don't want to be is a blood test where you walk away and you say, okay, what do I do now? Do I change my diet? Do I have to sleep more? It's much more proactive. So here's your brain. There's nothing wrong with you. Here's some advice that you can take away. See how that works for you, and then come back to us and we'll show how that's changed everything that we see on the screen.
Yeah. No, exactly. Beautiful, beautiful. Now, before going a little bit deeper into ADHD, because I'm personally interested in that field too, let's stick around a little bit longer with the making the invisible visible. Now, when someone sees the data for the first time, what tends to shift? What does it do to someone's kind of sense of identity when they realize this is the pattern, it's not who I am? Is it relief, validation?
It's a beautiful and it's a really insightful question. The number one feeling that people will have is validation. They'll get this overwhelming sense, I'm okay, I'm not broken. I didn't do anything wrong. It's the removal of shame. That's a huge one. And it's also this opportunity to understand oneself at a much deeper level and to be able to communicate outwardly to other people. This is who I am without any shame attached to it. This is what I need. This is the way my brain works. And therefore, this is how I show up in the world. So overwhelmingly, we would say validation. And I'll maybe give you 2 or 3 examples which are helpful, because our whole life affects our brain, but that doesn't mean it's pathological. So what I mean by that is events affect our brain, but they can be unwound. So the common thing that we would see regularly with individuals is trauma or PTS, sometimes PTSD, which we don't like to say, so more PTS. But when people have a traumatic event, it changes them. It changes their brain. And you can see that. You can see how it's changed their brain. But what you can also offer that person is insight as to how we can support them to get back to who they were. So you think of a traumatic event, people have a significant change in their identity. They become a different person. And sometimes they have to grieve the loss of their old self. That's part of the process. That's not something that we do, but that's something for them to do with their therapist or their professional or their family. And once they've done that, they can build themselves either forward into who they want to be, or perhaps they can overcome what they've been through. So I'll give you a specific example. So we had a client that went through a serious medical trauma. They were in hospital. They had an issue whereby after an operation, one of their lungs was filling with fluid, but they were in a ventilator, so they couldn't communicate. So the nurses and the doctors are walking by, and this person is incredibly slowly drowning. It must be one of the worst feelings you could possibly have over the course of about 10 hours. And their husband came in and saw them, and instantly, being their husband, knew something was wrong, got the doctor, pulled them in. They again looked at the chart and said, we need to get this person back into surgery. And they were able to, thankfully, stop bleeding into the lung. And as a result, the slow drowning that was happening. That is one of the most traumatic medical experiences someone could ever have. That changed them as a person. It changed their brain. So what did it actually change? It massively overwhelmed their fight or flight response. So now all of a sudden, their brain is constantly looking for threats because it's worried that something like that could happen again. It's changed the structure of how they see the world. So when they're having a conversation with a loved one, and maybe that loved one says something gentle back to them, makes a small comment, because their brain is so wired for safety, they're overreacting. They're having these big emotional outbursts, and then their family are overreacting back, and it's causing all this stress in the relationships. So that's nobody's fault. It's not the person's fault that was in hospital. That's certainly not their family's fault. And it's not even their brain's fault. It's all self protection. But this particular woman had spent a decade seeing various different specialists. But going back to our point at the start, they never looked at their brain. They weren't able to see what the problem was. So all of her family, this is, I think, the most profound thing. This wonderful woman just wanted to be back to who she was. All of her family wanted her back to who she was. She went through a hugely traumatic event, and everyone assumes you need to go to therapy. You need to go to talk therapy. You need to speak to a psychiatrist, a psychologist. You need to take drugs. Everyone, if from a good place, thinks they know what you need. We were able to look at her brain, show her the areas that have been affected. Instantly, a sense of relief. I'm not broken. I'm okay. There's nothing wrong with me. But then more so, you can say, talk therapy isn't going to help you. It really isn't. It's not. You reliving this over and over won't improve what you've been through. What you need is body-based therapy. You need somatic. Maybe it's breath work. Maybe it's hypnotism. Maybe it's EMDR. But these are very well studied therapies that support traumas and response to traumas. So much, much better than talk therapy, which may come later, by the way. Talk therapy might be really helpful to deal with some of the consequences of the family dynamics that have changed. But what we're able to give that woman is relief We're able to give her guidance, and we're able to say, look, there is a route back to the person that you were. And none of this is ever delivered without data to back it up. This is very data driven. This isn't, from our perspective, we want to really avoid anything that can be misconstrued as spiritual guidance, or it's just data. There's no good or bad attached to it. It's
Yeah.
just, this is what's happening in your brain. This is what the research says will help. This is what we would recommend you do. Please go and do that. Come back to us. Let's have a look at it again in 6 months. So always leaning onto the data and the available research as of today.
Yeah, great stuff. Great stuff. I'm very pleased also you mentioned the regulation type stuff, your inner regulation and the somatic side, the somatic regulation through the breath, etc. Now, I had a podcast with Neeraj. He's the founder of Soma Breath. I'm a facilitator. And I'm bringing his modality into my studio. So when I work with founders and wellness leaders in general, the first approach is indeed the regulation, the inner regulation through the breath. And to figure out indeed what you said before, I'm safe, I'm in a good place, and become more susceptible. So how do you work with the modalities here? Because try to understand, in your case, with Evolved Neuro, you get a map, you get insight into the functioning of the brain, people see it, but how does that give them an understanding to say, okay, I'm not broken. I'm trying to understand the combination of the two, seeing the brain function and then thinking, okay, I'm not broken.
Yeah. So, how do we make it understandable? Is how I understand the question. And I'll give you an example that links back to breath. So, what we try to do is we take this very complex organ, the brain. We know less about the brain than we do about the solar system. So, we know all this external knowledge about the universe, but we know less about what's in between our ears, which is really quite an amazing thing. So, we're still learning all the time. And we take that complexity and we try and simplify it to examples. So again, I think it's better to give you examples. So I'm sure you're dealing with CEOs and people in high pressure jobs. We had a CEO last week, a big insurance company, and we said the way that your brain is structured, you're incredibly logical. You'll see patterns faster than other people. So let me give you an example of what that's like for you in your day-to-day life. You're in a meeting, someone is explaining something to you very slowly. You've already figured out the point that they're trying to make. You're 2 steps ahead of them. Maybe that's why you've done well in your job. But his internal reaction is he's starting to get annoyed. He's getting agitated. He wants the person to hurry up. He knows that he shouldn't hurry them along because that's not going to help that person. They're already probably stressed presenting to the CEO. But he can feel this increase in tension internally because he's figured out what the person is going to say. There's nothing wrong with any of that. So, what he would historically have done is told the person to hurry up and get to the point. Then the individual on the other side feels upset, they feel emotionally overwhelmed. But the CEO, he's just moved on to the next point. He's got no attachment to that. I get it. You're not good. You're not bad. Let's just move on. In that instance, what happened is we told him the example and he burst out laughing. He said, that happened to me 2 hours ago. You're giving people real world examples of how their brain influences their interactions day to day.
Yeah.
And then he said, what can I do? Because I don't want to upset my team. And my leadership team is so important to me, but I keep having an issue where they leave meetings feeling emotionally dysregulated because of my reaction. And I think everything is fine. And that was a really simple piece of advice we were able to give him. We said, you're a few seconds ahead of people in these instances. All you need to do when you start to feel that sense of dis-ease, so obviously not disease, but that sense of I'm starting to want to move this conversation forward, you just take a deep breath, 6 seconds. So, a little bit longer than most people would think, but it's 3 seconds in. Let the person continue to make their point. 3 seconds out, you've now calmed. So he has regulated his nervous system. He knows the person is going to finish the point that they're making. They then get to complete. He can tell them what he was about to say 6 seconds earlier. And everyone leaves the interaction feeling much calmer. And ultimately, when you want to be successful in business, but in all aspects, calmness of the brain is what you want because you keep your thinking part of your brain, your neocortex, your frontal cortex activated by staying calm. As soon as emotion starts to build up, that's when your thinking brain is starting to go offline. And that's what we want to avoid. So it's just, again, it's decoding this complex organ, giving real world examples and saying, here's what you can do with it. And sometimes it's breath. Sometimes it's many other things as well.
Wonderful. It's wonderful. That's so powerful to give an example there as well, and to give a real practical instruction for someone on that position to regulate themselves at that point of time. It's beautiful. Yeah. So that is maybe some nice bridge into ADHD, because I see similarities with ADHD brain. Judging from myself, if I have the label, what then? I managed to regulate it myself. So I'm okay in that sense. But neurologically, what does ADHD actually look like? And how does true ADHD patterns differentiate from stress-induced attention issues?
Yeah, so I would even go a step further. One of the big things that people will say is, I've got ADHD. And what a huge amount of people may have ADHD, or they may have phone addiction. They may be spending too much time on devices. That has a significant effect on how your brain responds in your ability to focus, especially first thing in the morning. So just, I hate to give quick advice, but if someone is wondering, am I ADHD? Do I have ADHD? And a very simple test to do is go to bed, put your phone into a different room. When you maybe have to do this for 2 or 3 days, when you wake up the next day, do not look at your phone for the first hour. Just wait 1 hour. Go about your day, have your tea, stretch, whatever else you need to do. We can't do this all the time. So maybe this is a weekend test. But what you're looking at then is, has that allowed your brain the time to regulate itself so you can concentrate, you can focus, you don't have this device giving you quick attention responses and constantly flooding you with little pieces of pleasurable content and causing dysregulation. So we can all start by just taking a moment and maybe avoiding devices for a day or two and seeing, do we settle? So if we settle, that would be a good indication that we're not an individual that has pathological or clinical ADHD, because it's a different thing.
Yeah.
That's just distractibility. And many of us have that. And we live in a world where technology is designed to distract us. And there is hundreds of billions of dollars going into distracting us every single day. So we should give ourselves a bit of a break. It's understandable that so many people think that they have ADHD and maybe some don't.
Yeah.
So then when we go a step further and look at what ADHD is from a brain perspective, what we're looking for is high levels of variability. So if you go through a full ADHD assessment, you'll do lots of psychometric testing. And you'll do observations, you'll do interviews, you'll do questionnaires. This is the gold standard. It's hours and hours of data. And what the clinician is looking for is variability. Is this person really good at focusing in this area and really poor at focusing over here? Does it change from the 5th minute to the 10th minute of this assessment? Are they really focused on something they enjoy and then completely unable to focus on something that they're not interested in? Variability. I'm simplifying something complex, but one of the big things you look for in ADHD for people that have it clinically is high levels of variability and an inability to control focus when they want to. So they're amazing at focusing on things they like, but they're completely incapable of focusing on something that they don't like. And I think there's ADD and there's ADHD. And I think we should differentiate them, because the classic image that we have is the ADHD child in a classroom running around uncontrollable. Or the little boy or the little kid or the adult that's just constantly bouncing from A to B. Actually, ADD, a lot of that is happening in the person's head. They're having 100 different thoughts at the same time. They can't focus onto one thing. They can't get to the next task. But if you were to see that person in a classroom, or that more often a little girl, she'll just be staring out the window and it'll look like she's daydreaming. But she or he is going through a lot of the same things internally. And that's why for us, being able to see what's going on. So not just observing and visually observing someone and asking them to fill in a questionnaire and asking their parents. And that stuff is great, by the way. But the reason that you do all those things is because they give you the data to then understand what's happening foundationally. What we're saying is, why do we have to have a 2-year, 3-year waiting list? Because of this long process. if we have a measurement that will get me to the foundational data which I need, variability, so coming back to that concept of variability, if I can see that in the brain, I can skip all those other steps. And we would never want to remove the place of a qualified clinician. We would certainly never want to recommend someone goes on a certain path. That would always be done alongside a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and so forth. But what we can absolutely do is help to speed up all those steps and say, this is a brain with really high levels of variability. There is a much higher chance that this person has got ADHD versus here's another person who feels like they have ADHD, but their brain is very stable in the areas that we would really expect it not to be. So perhaps there's a few things that we can look at first before we send them down the path of medication and so forth.
Yeah.
So it's always coming back to that idea of variability. You want consistency is a good indication that someone isn't ADHD. And I'll just finish up one last point around ADHD if I can. There is this growing stigma or labeling or whatever you may want to call it, that ADHD is some terrible affliction and people are not able to operate with it. You're a perfect example. Once you learn to regulate it, it is incredible. I can't tell you how many Premier League football players, managers, CEOs, pilots, surgeons, the people at the pinnacle of their chosen profession have undoubtedly got ADHD, because when they find that thing they love, they can sit there for 18 hours and study or learn or develop or understand it. They'll kick a tennis ball against the wall for 15 hours. Paul Gascoigne, I've no idea, one of the greatest footballers of the last 50 years. But the way he talks about his childhood and just kicking a tennis ball against the wall, that would suggest ADHD. I'm not saying he did or didn't have it, but certainly being obsessive to the point that you'll do something for hours and hours, it works really well for sport. It works really well for learning.
Yeah.
But we live in this education system where you have to be good at everything. You have to be a little bit good at everything, or certainly very good at memorizing a lot of information to then go down the route of, say, being a doctor. But actually, being a doctor, you need to be really good at biology. You need to be really good at the requirements of being a doctor. All the other stuff is not necessary.
Yeah.
I think that for parents that worry that their kid may have ADHD and there's a big long waiting list, actually, what we would often say is get your child to 18 with their confidence intact. Accept that maybe the school system isn't perfect for them, but just get them through that childhood with their confidence in place. And once they find the one or two things that they love, they'll thrive. They will outperform everyone because their ability to focus will be so much more.
Beautiful, beautifully said. No, and I do feel related to that as well, the example you provide right there. Is it fair to say your 5-minute ADHD assessment, because it sounds quite bold, right? Especially in the world where you are years of waiting lists and tests and questionnaires and self-perception. So it's fair to say that you shorten the whole cycle in terms of honing in on areas that, or you said it's the variability that you measure. So you provide the clinicians with more information so they can treat them quicker or better. Is that kind of what you're saying that your assessment could do?
Yeah. So if I give the example, so let's use an adult that believes they have ADHD. They go through the process. Without going into too much detail, it could take them years to get to an assessment. And the reason is predominantly when they get to that assessment stage, they'll have to answer multiple questionnaires. They'll have to do multiple psychometric testing. That all has to be reviewed. They may then have to do interviews. They may have to do observations. That also needs to be reviewed, always by a clinician, a specialized clinician, of which there's very few. And they pull all that data together to get a picture of this image. And then a human, just a normal person like you and me, who's got a really finely tuned skill set around understanding ADHD, has to take all this disparate information and go, based on my clinical judgment and experience, and how I feel today, by the way, selection of data would suggest that this person has got ADHD. So as you can see, that's time consuming. It's time consuming for the clinician because they have to create a big report and they have to go into detail and they have to check things and they have to struggle with their own experiences to say, is this person ADHD? What else has happened? Have they just been through something big in their life? Have they just lost someone? There's all these other factors as well. So it's multifactorial, which is important. At the end of that process, they write the report, and that report is then often given to a psychiatrist who will make a decision around if the individual is going to be given drugs or if they're not. So it's a slow, mechanical process that has to be undertaken. What we're saying is 90% of that process can be replaced by understanding variability in the brain. All those steps are there to look for the variability. We can see the patterns in the brain. And by the way, this isn't something that we've just decided recently. We've been doing this for 20 years. We've been measuring brains for 20 years. We've been supporting people with ADHD for 20 years. Companies often that pop up with this new idea and you think, oh, wow, that's really novel. It's like we're the classic 20-year overnight success. It's all this data to get to the point where we can say, actually, these are the brain areas. We've written papers and research on this. These are the brain areas most connected to ADHD. When they are highly variable, when they're inconsistent, there is a much higher chance that someone has ADHD. Here's how they'll show up for the person. So from a 5-minute scan, we can write the report for the clinicians that takes days otherwise. So they come to us, we get the scan, we give them the report. We don't make any final decisions. We don't tell the clinician what to do. We just say, that report that used to take you 2 or 3 days to write, here you go. It's taken us 10 minutes. You're still the boss. You still make all the final decisions and you still support the individual. But we just speed up that process for you because all of the testing is a proxy for what's going on in the brain. If you think of it like a house, imagine you have a house and you think the foundations are shaky and someone says, we're going to have to take the roof off. And you go, okay, why would we take the roof off? Just go and look at the foundations. We're looking at the foundations. They're trying to look at the tiles. That's the difference.
Yeah.
And they're doing their best with what's available.
Yeah. No, that's a good analogy for sure. So once the patterns are identified, can they change? Where does neurofeedback fit? What's realistic in terms of the change?
Each individual is different, of course. And some people want to change and some people don't. Some people have an incredible response to various different pharmacological solutions. We had a patient recently who went on to Elvance and it was life-changing for her, really life-changing, helped her a huge amount, helped that busy brain become very focused. But she said, I don't want to take this every day. It changes something. She said, I feel great, but I don't fully feel myself. So now I have this tool. And if I've got a really tough day at work, I can take this tablet that I know will help me. I may not be able to sleep very well tonight. And again, just for her, just her example. And she's got a solution that supports her day to day. What it is not is the same solution for everybody. This is the thing with the brain. It's not a one-stop shop for us all. It's so personal. Like what may work for you, which you've probably learned over your whole life, that might not work for the next person. But what it could be is that you have built this strategy that you can pass on to your kids if you see them struggling. Just as a really simple, practical example, we're not trying to say there's a one size that fits all. What we're saying is there's a few different choices now. So one, are you doing things that naturally keep your focus? Let's lean into them. Let's do more of that. We're not going to try and change the whole school system as much as we might love to, but that is longer term. Individualized education will be really important.
Yeah.
So some of the specific examples, as I mentioned, some people, various different pharmacological solutions will work very well for them. Some people don't want to go down that route, especially with their children. So you mentioned neurofeedback. So neurofeedback is a biostimulation. So we're looking at those areas of the brain that have variability, and we're training the individual to have more control. By the process of they wear a headband and they'll play little games that kind of on an iPad or something like that, where they're controlling what's happening on the screen with their brain function. But at the back end, the band has been calibrated so that it will only give them a response on the screen when the brain area that they want more control over is reacting. So, what it looks like if you see someone doing it, they've got a headband on, they're looking at a screen, there's a character running or jumping or playing. What's actually happening is they're using their brain to control what's happening on the screen. And it's like building up a muscle. The more they do it, the more control they have over that muscle. So then when they need to outside of playing the game, when they need to focus, they've just got that little bit more capacity. So, like many things with neuroplasticity in the brain, you can train yourself the way perhaps you have, just brute force. Over years, you've learned strategies that have worked for you.
Yeah.
Or now you can use technology and you can use training of specific brain areas. You can use neurofeedback. There's other tools as well. And you can then learn to regulate that brain area yourself. And over time, I mean, it doesn't work for everyone, but about 80% of people that use neurofeedback will show improvements in control of focus and concentration.
Okay.
So, especially for children that are trying to get through school, it can be a really helpful tool. But we have to accept that it won't be right for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's wonderful. It's reassuring to hear these type of things as well. I've found a method for myself to regulate. I've used the vagus nerve stimulator. I'm using indeed also the breath on a daily basis. And that's for me, the calm clarity state is for me the most important state, because then I can function most efficiently. I can tap into probably 10 different things more effectively. So it's, as you said, you're right. Over the years, I'm 50, I've learned how to manage it. But there's obviously still things that you're curious about and you want to optimize. So and I think the brain is probably the next frontier in a way for me to start looking at, okay, so how can I stimulate the brain in such a way that I can maybe create a better baseline, which kind of brings me more towards the end of the podcast. For founders and wellness leaders who are listening and who want to understand, or they need to understand, that the brain baseline isn't a luxury. Before you scale your business, before you lead teams, before you optimize performance, you need a foundation, the baseline. Now, where does this fit in the bigger picture of long-term mental health?
Yeah, brilliant question. The way we would think about it, I think I saw Gabor Mate being asked a question about trauma, and it was a lady in the audience, and she'd obviously been through a very tough childhood. And she said to Gabor, "My parents did this, and how do I fix my kids? How do I make sure I don't pass this on to my kids?" That's what she was really concerned with. And he said, "You have to fix yourself." Everything starts with looking inwards. We are so conditioned to search out for solutions and find that external fix. What is the quick fix? But actually, so many of them are internal. I love the phrase, happiness is an inside job. It's so true
So
that
true.
but it's the same thing for performance. It's the same thing for optimizing your life, whatever way you want to put it. It starts internally. So if we can start with focusing on our own mental health before we try and change the world and maybe rant at someone on social media over something we disagree with, it's looking inwards to oneself and saying, what can I look at about myself? How can I regulate myself better? How can I control myself better to then show up in the world in the best possible way? And I think that most people live inside their brain without ever seeing how it runs. So they think they're lazy, they think they're anxious or sensitive, but they've never seen the operating pattern. So we use our scan to look at the brain system to see how it communicates, to see how it performs under load, not to label, but just to understand the patterns that are already there. And then when someone realizes that they're overthinking, there is a signal. If there's an exhaustion, there's a signal. If they start to understand what's causing these things, they stop trying to blame everything externally. They stop trying to fix themselves, in fact, and they see that they can control how they are wired and they can make the most of their brain. And therefore, that has a massively positive effect on everything around them. So it's that whole focus internally to get the best external results.
Wonderful. That's a beautiful ending to this podcast, because that is really, I think, the essence of it all. It's the self-regulation and it's looking inward rather than the fixes of the outside world. Thank you very much for all your insights, Pete. That was wonderful. Thanks very much for this
Absolute pleasure.
conversation.
I've enjoyed it.
What stands out to me after this conversation is how simple the shift really is. When you see the pattern, you soften the story. And when you see the data, you reduce the shame. When you understand what your brain is doing, you stop turning it into identity. And that feels important to me, because so much of modern life is reaction, fast conclusions, quick labels, surface fixes. But this work invites something different: to pause, to look, to understand, not as a quick fix, but as a foundation. Now, if we're willing to look at the brain in the way that we look at the rest of the body, we create a different starting point. One that's rooted in clarity, rooted in responsibility and possibility. And to everyone listening, curiosity changes everything. So take a breath, stay aware, and see you in the next Morphosis.